Hello everyone, my name is Ari Theriger and here I am to answer a couple of questions posed by Witchcraft Studies. Just 5 questions which honestly it could be extensively developed, but I'll try to keep it short and straight to the point. Very good questions, I must say.
And hello, it's Koreima here for Witchcraft Studies. Welcome to my channel. And thank you, Arith, for introducing this video, this interview. And this interview, due to some technical issues, we've made as separate videos that I've connected into one whole lovely piece that I hope that everybody will enjoy. So let's get into it. My first question is, how did the pagan spirituality looked like in old Scandinavia or Germania?
Well, the first thing we really have to take in mind is that even though between Germanic and Scandinavians there are a lot of similarities in their spiritual beliefs, folklore and mythology, they did not subscribe to any specific religion or a single religion. I know a lot of modern heathens don't like to hear this, but the truth is pre-Christian Germanic and Scandinavians performed cults and their faith turned very much around the preservation of traditional rituals. Only nowadays we have specific religions or organizations that strive to reconstruct old faiths. In pre-Christian Germanic regions and Scandinavia, there was a wondrous variety of cults and rituals, and as an archaeologist I can tell you that there are a lot of assumptions, ideas, possible interpretations, but a clear practical way on how spirituality worked and how rituals were conducted is something completely lost to us. The very basic and most important aspects of paganism, which are the sacrifices, offerings, religious practices, have been lost in great part. And now within the various neo-pagan religions and organizations we have created, people are recreating rituals to fit into our modern reality. Much of the ritual recreations are based on classical models. So in terms of Scandinavia, we can't say with certainty how spirituality really looked like. We have to base our knowledge on the archaeological findings and try to make certain plausible interpretations by comparing the findings with other European contexts. But we can say that Scandinavians did not subscribe to one single religion. There were many beliefs with certain similarities or certain notions that were shared by almost everyone. It's through mythology and some narratives preserved in poems or in sagas that we have any idea about the spirituality of pre-Christian Scandinavia, and subsequently with pre-Christian Germanic contexts, since a great portion of Scandinavian beliefs came from Central Europe during the periods of migration, especially during the Iron Age. We can also say with absolute certainty that great hulls between the Germanic and Scandinavian peoples played a very important role in the lives of these people. Great hulls were places of socialization, of manifestation of authority and of power. Hulls were places where loads of social ceremonies and even religious ceremonies were held. It was the place where the local elite demonstrated their power. The great hulls were the ultimate expression of cults, feasts and manifestations of power. So hulls became the focal point of Scandinavian cosmology, an icon of sacredness. Great hulls were instruments for executing religious, political and other social activities. Throughout pre-Christian Germanic and Scandinavian history, even pre-Roman, we can clearly see these societies developed around the figure of the chieftain, especially during the Bronze Age and Iron Age. It was the chieftain of a particular tribe that held the political, military and religious powers, and his wife played a very important role in divinatory activities, greatly linked to magical activities. the centralization of the figure of the chieftain evolved to the great whole, the structure of power. In archaeological terms, religious practices of these pre-Christian societies were characterized by a great insertion of magic both in daily life and public life, to the point that it is almost impossible to separate the two realities. Religion in ancient Scandinavia had a lot of magic. So that leads me to speak a bit about the spiritual reality outside the urban centers or any other kind of social group. Since there was a lot of folk magic involved in the rituals, a lot of people practiced all sorts of magic, and animal sacrifices played a huge role in rituals. We have the perception of spiritual and magical activities more shamanic oriented, others are clearly focused on a specific deity for a specific purpose. Let me give you an example. For instance, sacrificing cats to Freya in performances of fertility magic. So, spirituality in Germanic regions and in Scandinavia in pre-Christian times was much diversified. You could have someone devoted to a particular deity, while others would worship the three main gods, Huden, Thor, and Freyr. Some would perform divination, others particular rituals for a single purpose, magic, sorcery, seidr, galdr. Basically, each person performed their rituals and ceremonies according to their specific needs. And within the communities, the religious authority was held by the local elite, and there were many attempts to organize the faith. So many people participated and conducted a lot of ceremonies, feasts and rituals in specific occasions, specific dates throughout the year. But the rest of the year, people did as they pleased. So that's why it's very difficult to say how spirituality was in these societies, because there were countless realities, and we understand this religious freedom in medieval Iceland, for instance. Most Norwegians who settled in Iceland brought with them their own religions and spiritualities and gave a continuation to this religious freedom. Some would worship a waterfall, others were devoted to land spirits, some would venerate nameless solar deities, others were particularly devoted to Thor or Freyja, and some trusted solely on their own might and strength. Others performed rituals, magic, sorcery, divination, rune magic, etc.
Thank you very much. And my next question is, what are Asatru, Vanatru, Rokatru and Tursatru? Is it something from the past, or is it rather some nowadays concept? Also, I know that our time is kind of limited, so under the video I will link more videos by Arith where he goes more in depth of each of the truths.
Yes, these are all neo-pagan reconstructions. Some are more philosophical than others. As I've said in the previous question, there wasn't a specific organization in pre-Christian Scandinavia. Ásatrú is definitely a religion with a couple of official organizations, mostly in England, Iceland and North America, USA. Which are the three main countries that started the development of reconstructing Scandinavian old faiths. Ásatrú is just an attempt to reconstruct parts of the pre-Christian Scandinavian faith, very much focused on the Aesir tribe of gods, occasionally including Freyr and Freyja from the Vanir. This is the only branch of Nordic neo-paganism that has a clear, organized religious structure, conducts ceremonies, sacrifices, feasts, and there is a very healthy and thorough work in the recreation of the Old Norse pagan faiths. Vanatru, it's almost a spirituality that came to give a certain opposition to Ásatrú, because Ásatrú began as a faith that tried to focus on all the gods, but as it developed throughout the 20th century, it became much more focused on perspectives of social order and social activities, much more concerned with the community and the needs of a society. So much more focused on the Aesir as the main tribe of Norse deities. So in contrast, Vanathrú came to focus on Old Norse spirituality in other realities, much more concerned with fertility aspects of life, magic. Well, in truth, Vanathrú is an attempt to get closer to the true sense of the word paganism, as in classical Latin paganos, rural and rustic. So Vanathrú is a much more nature-oriented spirituality without the organized religious structure of Ásathrú. Vanathrú is the only branch of neo-paganism, neo-pagan Nordic faith that I haven't made a video of, and I would very much like to develop that in the future. This doesn't mean that Ásathrú isn't also nature-oriented in certain aspects. What we have to understand is that we have come to a point in which Ásathrú is a branch of Nordic paganism, and Ásathrú itself already has ramifications. And within Ásathrú, there are certain groups that conduct things differently. Some prefer to be more nature-oriented, others prefer to focus on more philosophical and scientific aspects, while others focus much more on the myths, etc. Speaking of Hrokathru, the main purpose of this spirituality is indeed to focus in all the gods and all the spiritual entities of the Old Norse faith. Hrokathru also includes the so-called Rokr or Rokar type of deities, such as Loki, Angrboda, Jormungandr, etc. Hrokathru tries to focus on the darker and chaotic aspects of nature and the universe, as well as the lighter and more orderly aspects, trying to see a balance, not dividing the faith into a dualistic perception of good and evil, but on order and chaos as realities that are necessary in order to give continuation to existence. As I have said before, the darker and chaotic aspects of life, nature, and the universe must be encountered and accepted, not evaded and denied. By knowing the dark side of wisdom, the self is refined. So Hrokathru aims to include all the gods and all the aspects of nature, trying to break the dualistic aspects of religion. Ásathrú, for instance, denies the chaotic entities of the Old Norse faith as being gods, and therefore they are not included in the worshipping. And as such, half of the understanding of Old Norse views on the spiritual and divine realities is simply put aside. However, there is a particular problem within Hrokathru. Most people who claim to be Hrokathruar prefer to focus their spirituality on personal gnosis. I respect that, and there is nothing wrong with that, until people blindly believe in their own personal knowledge of the gods. And this leads to many problems because people start to believe in fantasy characters or create their own fantasies that go absolutely against Nordic paganism or paganism in general. And people claim that the gods spoke to them and told them their stories. I repeat, there's nothing wrong with that, choosing to live in a personal fantasy, but many times their personal fantasies are perspectives from other faiths that have nothing to do with Old Norse beliefs. And it turns out to be a complete mess, and obviously no one will take these people seriously. This is not what Hrokathru is about, and I'm not sure why there is this increasing belief in personal gnosis within Hrokathru. Certainly, it's a spirituality much more focused on shamanism or shamanic activities, but one thing is constructing a plausible and well-structured spirituality, and another is living one's fantasies and claiming to know the real truth about the gods. That's the real problem of personal gnosis, to claim that they know the truth because the gods told them. Maybe the gods spoke to them, but I highly doubt the gods told them stories with a lot of Wiccan, Buddhist and even Christian perspectives. Blind personal gnosis certainly gives a bad name to what Rokkathru is trying to aim at. Rokkathru tries to focus much more on a Paleolithic and prehistoric perspective in general of Old Norse beliefs, without religion as a means of expressing faith, but rather raw spirituality. Thursarthru is a philosophical and spiritual understanding of Old Norse religion and mythology, but it must be underlined that when Thursarthru was created, the basis of this philosophy cannot be considered pagan in nature. However, many modern heathens adopted certain aspects and philosophical perspectives of Thursarthru and applied to Nordic paganism. Thursarthru has its basis in anti-cosmic Satanism, which is a form of Gnosticism, and therefore dualistic views were brought into Norse myths in this path. But dualism itself is foreigner to the original nature of Old Norse beliefs. So in this aspect, Thursarthru is not the rebirth of any tradition of Old Norse practices and religious beliefs. It's something completely new, but highly interesting that should definitely be explored, because the philosophical, spiritual perspectives of Thursarthru focus much more on the chaotic and darker aspects of life, nature, and the universe, aiming to reach enlightenment precisely by understanding the darker aspects of all things, without creating a fantasy world where everything is good and pure. Unlike the three previous neo-pagan reconstructions of Old Norse beliefs, Thursarthru is considered a left-hand path of Old Nordic spirituality, much more focused on the development of the self rather than the community. So it's much more individualistic.
Okay, and then why do you think that we divide the whole faith into these kind of categories, these truths? How can it be helpful for spirituality of somebody?
Well, the term true is in fact the Old Norse word for faith. A lot of people made a certain confusion with this word and made a relation with the word truth. So even nowadays the great majority refers to Thursarthru as meaning to be true to the gods, when in truth it means the faith of the gods or faith in the gods. Faith in the Aesir, not as in the tribe of gods, but Aesir as the plural form of Hals, which is deity or god in Old Norse. So all these branches end up being a particular faith in something. Thursarthru to the great majority means the faith in the gods, while to others is the faith solely in the Aesir tribe of gods. Vanathru is the faith of the Vanir, Rokkathru the faith in the Rokr, Thursarthru the faith or in the Thursar and Jotnar. And there is actually a branch of Thursarthru which focuses much more on the Jotnar than the Thursar. But that's not the point of this question. We have already come to a point where there are a lot of branches of the reconstruction of an old pagan faith. And I think that's healthy, provided that people behave in a civilized manner and are able to have conversations. There has been a lot of spirituality and philosophy added to the Old Norse faith, certain thoughts and perspectives that I highly doubt existed in pre-Christian Scandinavia. But based on what I have studied about the history and archaeology of Scandinavia and the history of religion of Scandinavia, as well as folk magic, pre-Christian Scandinavians really had a very complex mind and understanding towards the spiritual and the divine. I have said this many times, there is no reason to believe that we nowadays are on a higher intellectual and spiritual level than our ancestors were. So I think it's perfectly healthy and highly educational to have different perspectives on a certain faith, provided that people can put on the table, so to speak, plausible and well-structured arguments. It's very dangerous to stick to one single understanding of a specific faith that is called religion, a single unique perspective people follow without question. It's very good that the attempts to reconstruct the Old Norse beliefs gain more and more ramifications and spiritual understandings and philosophies, because in that way we are able to make comparisons, share knowledge, exchange knowledge, having healthy and civilized conversations that helps us in our own spiritual pursuits, and obviously to acquire more knowledge so we can reach a higher understanding and greater wisdom. As an archaeologist, I have studied countless religions and faiths to be able to understand the archaeological contexts I'm in when it's something related to religion, which is 90% of the time when we deal with ancient cultures. So I think we should do exactly the same in our own religions and spiritualities. Try to understand different perspectives within the same faith, to have an open mind to listen at the very least, taking our own conclusions, sharing those conclusions, and gain even more knowledge and new perspectives. Because that's what paganism is all about, a constant evolution of ideas. Knowledge is meant to flow, not to be stagnated.
Does each true have some specific kind of magic?
Well, no and yes. Each person does it as they please, and to do magic, a person doesn't necessarily have to be bound to a specific branch of a faith. Certainly, within Rokkathru, the general idea is to focus on shamanic activities and animistic notions, while in Thurzathru, as I've said before, it's considered the left-hand path, so the black arts are the focus of magical practices. But one thing is the personal faith, and another is magical arts, sorcery, and the occult. To some, faith influences their magical practices, while to others, it's something completely different. Let's put it in these terms. We have employed ritual as a means of expressing our involvement in the powers of the universe, as a means of gaining contact with those powers and of causing them to manifest themselves to us. Magic involves the belief that humans, through their rituals, could directly control natural forces or magical essence, that which we often label as black magic or white magic. So what I mean with this is that magical practices highly depend on the purpose each person aims at. What happens within the various branches of neo-pagan reconstructions of Old Norse beliefs in terms of magic is the exact same thing that happened in pre-Christian Scandinavia, as I have answered in the first question. There is a wondrous variety of magical practices, and each person does it as they please, just as there were many magic workers in the old world. The same thing happens today. That hasn't changed much. Regardless of the faith, each person does whatever type of magic they feel more inclined to. However, I think it's important to say this, In terms of magic work, the neo-pagan reconstructions of the old Nordic faith give more freedom of practice. For instance, in Wicca, there is this permanent warning against using dark magic, claiming that the person who uses black magic have their magic come back to them threefold. This type of moral guidance is inexistent in the Nordic faith because it was inexistent in pre-Christian Scandinavia and even in early medieval Iceland. All possible types of magic and attempts to do magic were performed. Allowed or not, there was no moral guidance. Certainly, there were certain social stigmas when it came to use specific types of magic, but it was done anyway. It wasn't specifically forbidden back then, and nowadays, at least within the Nordic faith, it's not forbidden either.
My last question is, since based on some myths, we could say that Asatru and Galdr is more male type of magic and worship, while Vanatru and Seidr is more connected with women. Do you think that this is still kind of appropriate in nowadays times? Isn't it slightly against gender equality?
As I've said in the previous question, yes, there were social stigmas when practicing certain types of magic or spiritual activities. We know that Galdr was very much part of Seidr. It constituted a great portion of Seidr magic because Galdr was the use of the voice in singing incantations used within Seidr. It wasn't just singing and chanting, it was the vibration of the voice. So it wasn't just pronouncing words. Most of the time it was the vibration of the voice. Galdr was used in Seidr, and it went like that for a millennia since prehistoric times. The tribal and shamanic communities of the Arctic continued to do both because there wasn't a clear division between Galdr and Seidr. Only during late Viking Age a clear division is created between Seidr and Galdr, and that division was much more evident in Iceland. I suspect that man, the male, stopped doing Seidr magic in general and preferred to adopt only certain aspects of magic, precisely due to Christianity, which had a very strong opinion against witchcraft and folk magic. Christians didn't seem to understand that chanting was very much part of magical incantations and formulas, and considered it simply singing. Also, Christianity, much like almost every Middle Eastern religious concepts, did not approve of homosexuality. It was highly forbidden, a reason to be executed. Seidr had a lot of effeminate performances due to the use of phallic objects, the use of the distaff, which had a very phallic shape. I have a video about that where I have developed that with a little more depth. The point is, due to Christian religious and social rules and stigmas against homosexuality and against women in general, men were not allowed to do things considered effeminate by medieval Christian standards, and women were not allowed to do manly things. Some men practiced Seidr, but that doesn't mean that they were homosexual. The problem was that they were doing things considered effeminate, and that social stigma changed greatly the entire view on Seidr and Galdr within the Scandinavian society. The entire collective consciousness of these societies was altered. But before the late Viking Age, before the Middle Ages in general, for a millennia, Seidr and Galdr was practiced by both men and women. We have to take in mind that at least since the late 7th century and the early 8th century, Christianity already started to have influence in Denmark and quickly spread into Scandinavia. And the great majority of the written sources we have about this social stigma and forbidding men to practice Seidr, because it wasn't manly, comes after this period, and sources written by Christians. So, if people nowadays want to embrace paganism, they should be aware that a lot of social stigmas and stipulated gender roles were brought by foreigner religions that have nothing to do with a European pagan understanding. These social rules can no longer be applied to our modern reality. They make no sense whatsoever. When dealing with Old Norse beliefs, people have the tendency to focus solely on the Viking period and assume the entire pre-Christian Nordic faith was exactly as it was in the Viking period. The Viking period is a very short period in the history of Scandinavia, and even during the Viking Age, not everybody was a Viking, and a lot of people kept older faiths and did not subscribe to the main faiths of the Viking Age. So nowadays, men and women can and should practice whatever they wish to practice, just as our ancestors did. There wasn't one single religious law in pre-Christian Scandinavia that forbade people to do this or that. There were as many faiths and as many cults as there were people. Thank you very much for these questions, Witchcraft Studies and Ms. Josie Reuter. It was an honor and certainly my pleasure to answer all these questions. Thank you. Farewell.
Thank you as well, Arith. It was absolutely amazing that you agreed to answer my questions, and I hope that everyone will check your channel that I will also link down below the video. And thank you very much once more, and see you soon.